on 6 July 2126 at 11:41 UN Standard Time. Anonymous wrote, "His name was Rolando. His name was Rolando, and like anyone under UN jurisdiction, he wanted to change. He wanted to live above the class system and look down on those who stood above him in his youth. Rolando went to El Circo as often as he could, always hoping for Javier and La Trinidad to give him a chance. Even a heel match with a kayfabe outcome. In short, Rolando seethed with desire to live the life. Finally, his chance came. Rolando had submitted his DNA for analysis, as did all potential luchadors. Once Javier's medical staff had decided whether or not Rolando could be of use, he was invited to go up against Estrello in a Saturday afternoon match that was to be televised. Getting on TV during one's first match was not unheard of, but it was certainly rare enough to make others take note. The match began with Rolando being able to hold his own through several difficult maneuvers. However, Estrello essentially toyed with him for the first 5 minutes. After Estrello broke out a few dazzlers to get rid of some ring rust, Javier gave the sign while Rolando lay on the mat, begging for the ref to stop the fight. Estrello stalked his prey, plotting how to end the match. An Irish whip to the ropes launched Rolando into Estrello's devastating Frankensteiner. Rolando's head smacked the ring floor, giving his spinal column a jolt. Dazed, he scrambled to pull himself up on the ropes, only for Estrello to leap over his head and then contort Rolando into his signature submission, the tarantula. Rolando could feel the discs between his vertebrae shrinking as Estrello locked the hold in place. After 45 grueling seconds, Rolando gave in and blacked out. That was the last time anyone in Los Volcanes saw Rolando Vazquez Villar they knew and loved. Over time, there were sightings of a man driving a ground-level, turbine-converted military transport with a canvas-covered bed while wearing the exact mask Rolando had worn the night he lost to Estrello and subsequently vanished. The sightings became so frequent that, after a while, one of Rolando's relatives decided to investigate. Carlos Juarez de la Tienda Villar made sure his plasmatic pistol had fresh Ionian algae in it. He headed out after he saw the turbine in question pass by on its way out of the city, following closely on a hoverboard in camouflage. After a little over an hour, they arrived at Narco Farm number 729-Q near Cocotitlan. The imposing hive rose into the sky about 7 stories by Carlos' estimate. Flocks of nocturnal birds circled around the top of the hive, squawking and diving down into the jungle within. What could they possibly be growing here? Carlos thought to himself. Carlos hung back and watched as the armed guards shined their lights into the cab and then into the back of the truck. Their inspection turned toward the undercarriage and ended with a walk-around. The heavy gates, resembling a clasped pair of hands, slid apart and the truck crept into the compound. Carlos took advantage of what looked like flirting between the two guards and shot in behind the truck. On the other side of the gate was a jungle of foliage bent and contorted into a tunnel. The truck's brake light served as his guide while he kept low behind the old converted military transport. Eventually, he caught up to the vehicle and grabbed hold of a handle next to the tailgate. Peeking around the side of the truck, Carlos almost lost his head to a tree branch. The truck had turned off of the dirt road and out of the tunnel and was now seemingly carving its own path through the jungle. Carlos risked his head once more and noticed that they were approaching a clearing. He let go of the handhold and kick-flipped into a shrub where he watched the truck park outside of a small, overgrown hangar drowning in jungle flora. The mass of chlorophyll delivery systems peeled back when the truck approached. The large turbine engine shuttered off and the doors kicked open. The man in Rolando's mask hopped out and joined a man in a lab coat approaching from the passenger side, and they walked into the now open hangar. After an interval, Rolando and the fellow in the lab coat re-emerged with more guards and lowered the tailgate of the truck, converting it into a small staircase. Trailing behind the guards were men in luchador masks, shimmering green coveralls, fetters, and chains. The men in luchador masks were led into the back like sheep, and the guards locked them into the seats that filled the back of the truck. Then, more men in lab coats filed up from the hangar and came over to the truck itself. Climbing into the back, they began to hook up IV lines connected to a tank mounted on the inner ceiling of the truck to the backs of the masked men's heads. A mildly luminous green liquid began its flow from the tank and into the masked, listless men. All at once, the masked men went limp in their restraints. The lab coats now left the truck and walked with the guards back into the hangar from which they emerged. Rolando walked back to the driver's side and climbed into the cab. The truck's turbine whined to life and the vehicle swung around. Carlos then spotted a second occupant in the truck's cab. The truck groused as it turned and began heading back out the way it came in. Carlos clutched his plasmatic pistol, took a breath, and grabbed onto the truck's back bumper as it rumbled by. Behind them, the hangar doors closed with the guards and the doctor securely inside, and the dense foliage snapped perfectly back into place as the truck progressed, concealing both the facility and the vehicle's tracks. Carlos climbed up and looked into the back of the truck. The men were out cold, their lifeless bodies reacting to the truck's movements as it lumbered through the dense jungle. The truck turned out from the foliage tunnel leading to the hangar and onto the proper road. As the truck whined toward the guarded main entrance, Carlos climbed with his board over the tailgate into the back of the truck and joined the lifeless men in masks. Ducking under the bench seats, Carlos held his breath as the guards looked in, under, and through the truck. Carlos waited in agony, and finally the truck pulled off. He waited until he knew that they were alone along the dark road that connected the rural districts to the metropolitan. Carlos decided that now was his chance. He emerged from under the bench seats and activated his hoverboard. Again, climbing over the tailgate, he slipped his foot into the board's secure harness and began to hover behind the truck, his hands holding tightly to whatever he could find. Carlos crept along the outside of the truck and made his way to the passenger door by letting his fingers guide him. In the passenger side mirror, he noted the two men riding in the cab. The man in the passenger seat wore a mask that Carlos had never seen before. The mask was yellow with black and blue accents around the eyes and mouth, and on the crown was a yarmulke-shaped logo that resembled the national seal of the Free Republic of Venezuela. The FRV? Carlos wondered. What is someone from outside the UN-sanctioned territories doing here? Limited to the passenger side view mirror, Carlos could only see the eyes of the driver who was wearing Rolando's mask, and he knew right away it was Rolando. Those were the eyes Carlos spent years looking into. They were indisputably the very pupils that had once maintained rapt focus during any and all advising, admonishing, and encouraging. Without his father's ready presence, Rolando had silently begged his uncle for tutelage over the years as a youth. Carlos moved further alongside the truck until he was just behind the passenger door. Carlos deactivated his hoverboard and clipped it onto his small backpack. It was here he laid out his plan in his mind, noticed the complete lack of supervision along this empty country road, and took his shot. Carlos snapped into position on the running board below the passenger side window and fired the plasmatic pistol into the face of the man in the passenger seat. With a flash, the man's head exploded, letting loose a steady flow of foul-smelling green ooze. The body convulsed and the left arm shot for the wheel, causing the truck to careen toward a ditch. Rolando corrected and kept the truck from catastrophe. Carlos flung open the passenger door and hurled the now limp and headless Venezuelan from the cab. Rolando! Rolando, it's me, Carlos! What the hell are you doing? Carlos panted as the shock of kicking a headless, oozing man out of a speeding turbine settled in. Rolando remained silent and focused on the road. Tears began streaming from Carlos' eyes as Rolando couldn't acknowledge his uncle's pleas. Up ahead, Carlos was able to make out what looked like a checkpoint. Panicking, he scrambled around the cab, trying to think of something, anything he could do to dissuade the guards from looking further into the green mess in the cab. Stuck to the cab's roof was the majority of the Venezuelan's mask, the face mostly intact. Carlos took a deep breath, grabbed the warm, viscous mask, and slid it over his quaking face. The truck slowed to a stop at the toll booth-like checkpoint, and Carlos kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, just like Rolando's. The guards, two of them, casually strolled out from the dimly lit shack. Their teeth were black from the lysergic beetle nut gum that Javier produced at the farm the truck had just come from. The guards first checked what was most important, the cargo in the back. Apparently satisfied, the guards pallidly waved the truck through. The arm lifted, Rolando released the brake, and the truck whined on. Carlos watched the side view mirror with stiff paranoia, and he finally exhaled when the post was out of sight. He ripped off the disgusting mask and spit. Crying again, he wiped his eyes and turned to Rolando. Rolando, we've missed you. Me, your tia Manuela, your siblings, your wife, Carlos pleaded. Rolando, we had no idea what happened to you after the match with Estrello. We shunned the rumors people from outside the metro areas were spreading. Poison, filth, venom, we all said. Carlos opened the glove compartment and discovered a pack of Sol Verde Supremo cannabis and opium cigarettes with a hashish center, and lit one. He sat for a minute, letting the THC and other compounds course through his body. He felt the opium relax his shoulders and take away his disgust and replace it with remorse. Carlos now came to the realization that all the rumors were, in fact, true. The sweet-smelling cigarette, now halfway put to rest, sizzled in Carlos' fingers. Listless and empty, Carlos turned to Rolando. Rolando, I made a promise to your father before he was taken too. I told him I would raise you right. I told him I wouldn't let you fall to El Burro. His lips quivering, Carlos unsheathed his glass plasmatic pistol. The Ionian algae within bounded in its translucent enclosure above the barrel. I'm sorry, Vicente, Carlos muttered. Rolando's head sharply turned to face him. His eyes ablaze, Rolando went for the gun. Carlos blocked the advance, but the truck swerved. Carlos leapt for the wheel while shoving Rolando's head into the back of the driver's seat. The truck was now approaching the outskirts of Metro Mexico City, about 27 minutes out from Los Volcanes. Other cars slowly started appearing on the now paved highway they were crisscrossing. Rolando's strength was unceasing, and Carlos couldn't match it for much longer. The truck ran a small, rusted van off the road and into a storefront. Rolando's hand shot under the dash and withdrew a gilded blade. Carlos saw an ancient pump gasoline station coming up and jammed his boot onto Rolando's wingtip, gunning the turbine engine. Rolando arched back and slammed the blade deep into Carlos' stomach. Carlos howled and grit his teeth as blood forced its way between each tooth and into the cab. Rolando's mouth popped open. An awful banshee shriek began blaring out. The truck hit the curb, making it airborne. Carlos erupted through the confusion and squeezed the trigger. The Ionian algae, fully amplified, sprayed its raging interstellar electromatter into the midsection of Rolando, causing another eruption of green luminescence. His limp body gently slumped over into the door. The truck plowed into a row of gas pumps, spray painting the neighborhood in a caustic white. High-temperature white fire engulfed the truck, spurred on by the green liquid tanks in the back. The metal frame proved too weak for the intense heat, and within minutes the truck was an ashen crater. People from the neighborhood poured out to see what had happened. The police arrived along with one of Javier's cleanup crews. The area was cordoned off. A tent was erected, and the armed guards were deployed. The next morning, nothing remained but a large open sore in the earth. End. Carlos' story survived due to his personal black box. Carlos was a former member of MSF-9, or Los Nueves Muertos, Mexico's Black Ops division, and subsequently paranoid and meticulous about every aspect of his life. Before setting out on this mission, he set up a relay on himself. Everything he saw and heard was live-streamed to a computer in his house. His wife knew what was going on, and it tortured her to open the file the next day after he didn't return home. To honor his memory and sacrifice, she leaked the video on the Ultranet. It was only up for 22 hours, but during that time, it started a fire, and more stories and experiences were subsequently posted. The rumor mill in this part of town nearly exploded as stylized portraits of Carlos and Rolando began appearing on flyers, in graffiti, and of course on the Ultranet. And yet, while people raged on the message boards, no one was bold enough to come from behind their keyboard and point the finger at El Burro. The police and UN patrols regulated the legal distribution of Javier's raw narco crops to the major manufacturers of narco products, who also employed nearly everyone in Los Volcanes. Somehow, some way, if one lived in the pith, they owed their livelihood to El Burro. Who could the people turn to? Who was there to stand up to the man who made this district the gem of Mexico City? El Burro built this city and the lives of all its inhabitants. Would anybody point a finger at him, risking their life and the lives of every person they knew? And for what? So the UN could swing its big stick again and globally shame yet another citizen? No, no, no. Not Manuela, not Carlos' children, not even Rolando's wife was willing to openly turn a spotlight on Javier's work.